After completely sidelining the Quad, US President Joe Biden is pitting G7 against China. But why is the sitting US President doing so, you may ask? Well, as it turns out, over the years, G7 has turned into a powerless, leaderless, and rudderless organization, and its actions will hardly do any harm to the paper dragon. And by entrusting G7 to put pressure on China, Biden is only helping Xi Jinping and fooling the Americans and the world at large. Hi and welcome to TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I am your host Sanbir, and in this video we will talk about how Joe Biden's call to pit the G7 against China doesn't worry the strategic circles in the communist nation. Let's begin. Noticed one big change in the China policy of the US after Joe Biden came to power? Well, we know there are way too many changes with Biden using kid gloves to handle Beijing. But we are talking about the increased reliance on the Group of Seven or G7, which is a bloc comprising the most advanced world economies. With Donald Trump in power, the Quad comprising India, the US, Australia and Japan was leading the battle against China. But Biden has completely sidelined the Quad. Now, Biden wants to contain China with the G7 instead of Quad. The American coercive action is also being routed through G7. But why? Well, what G7 does hardly harms China. The organization is powerless, leaderless and rudderless, and interestingly, this is exactly why a pro-Beijing Biden is pitting G7 against China. The United States has now urged its G7 allies to increase pressure on China over the use of forced labor in Xinjiang. Dalip Singh, Deputy National Security Advisor to Biden and the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, said these, as in G7 countries, are like-minded allies, and we want to take tangible and concrete actions that show our willingness to coordinate on non-market economies such as China. Singh added, the galvanizing challenge for the G7 is to show that open societies, democratic societies, still have the best chance of solving the biggest problems in our world, and that top-down autocracies are not the best path. Yet, the American call to pit the G7 against China doesn't worry strategic circles in Beijing. The Xi Jinping administration used to get traumatized whenever the Trump administration mobilized Quad against China. Meltdowns in the Chinese state-run media publications like Global Times were also visible, and Chinese officials used to condemn such containment attempts. But with Biden bringing G7 into the equation, there is no palpable sense of nervousness in the Chinese quarters. Rather, there is a hint of indifference. Earlier this month, for example, trade ministers of the G7 nations pledged collective action against harmful industrial subsidies. This was, of course, aimed at China, though the communist nation wasn't specifically named. British Trade Minister Liz Truss even said that it was time for the group to get tough on China and their behavior in the global trading system. In a joint statement, the G7 said, trade ministers will discuss the impact market-distorting practices such as harmful industrial subsidies, including those causing excess capacity in some sectors, are having on our economies and chart a way to address these collectively. However, Beijing remained undeterred. Andy Mock, a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, a Beijing think tank, made it clear that China wouldn't back down even if the G7 statement was actually aimed at it. Mock said that any such attempt was doomed to fail. Mock explained, this of course is the US looking to maintain its supremacy. I think several of these other G7 countries are also caught in a bind because on the one hand, the US is pressuring them to form this united front, and of course, they know that China does not want to see this ganging up against China, and they know there will be consequences as China becomes more and more assertive. The research fellow concluded, I think some are just opting out and some are only participating by providing verbal support. I think they may not follow as vigorously an actual action later. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying gave a very casual response to the G7 statement. She said that China would not accept any accusation of its trade practice, as it has always honored its commitments and safeguarded the multilateral trading system after joining the WTO in the year 2001. So, China is almost completely dismissive of what the G7 plans to do. From Biden's perspective, this works out perfectly. At home, Biden was facing some tough questions about his soft China policy. Americans were realizing how their president was giving up American leadership against China, but a pro-Beijing Biden remained simply too reluctant to punish China. However, by pitting G7 against China, Biden is assured that he is not actually harming the paper dragon. At the same time, he is using the directionless and leaderless group to issue tough statements against Beijing. The US president is trying to convince Americans that he is actually condemning and punishing China. So, by pitting G7 against China, Biden is only helping China and fooling Americans.